Today, we are in the Schoen Library on the picturesque campus of Marylhurst University in Marylhurst, Oregon, which is near Portland. We are interviewing Virginia J. Kelsh. Virginia retired in 2005 from the position of Professor of Law and Law Librarian at the University of San Francisco. Virginia, who had been at the university since 1983, was named Professor and Law Librarian Emerita at her retirement. Before we proceed with our conversation today, I would like to mention a special significance of our being here today at Marylhurst University. Marylhurst is where Virginia did her undergraduate work. Virginia, let's begin with a little personal history. Could you tell us about your life when you were young and perhaps today?
Well, I was born in Portland, and I was born into a large Catholic family. It wasn't quite that large. I was the middle child of 6 girls and 1 boy. My father was a civil engineer, and my mother had worked when she was younger. They married when they were both 29, so she had worked for a while, and then she became a homemaker after that. But she was the one that really should have become a lawyer because she was very loquacious and tenacious and inquisitive. And I always told her that she should either be an investigative reporter or a lawyer. And my father actually was gone most of the week. He was a project engineer for hydroelectric projects in Oregon, so he would spend the week away and then come home on the weekends. But he taught us a lot of work ethic. I forgot to mention that I was born on 2 holidays. I was born on April Fool's Day and Easter, and those coincided again when I was 11. And they'll coincide again, I think, when I'm 73. So I always had interesting birthdays. We had, of course, with 6 girls and 1 boy, we had a built-in social structure. And once I was 11 months old, we moved to Salem, Oregon, the state capital. My grandmother lived there and a lot of my cousins, so our social group was quite large. And our backyard was quite large. We had a full-size slide and a teeter-totter that my dad had built that went up and down and around. And so we just had, a lot of people in our home and in our backyard and had lots of fun growing up. I started working probably when I was 12 years old. My sisters and I would go out on the berry platoons and we picked beans and berries during the summer. Because we were going to Catholic schools, that helped pay for our tuition. So my father opened bank accounts for us at that age, and he also taught us how to do our tax returns at that age. So I think he did teach us a lot, even though he wasn't with us very long. He died when he was 60, and so I only knew him. He was only in my life for about 31 years or less. Actually less, because I was not the first child born after they got married. My mother, to keep us occupied, she would take us to the farm team baseball games, and she'd take us to watch our cousins play basketball. So we just had a normal childhood. We didn't have a lot of things, but we had a lot of fun growing up together and playing together. And because all 7 of us were born within 10 years. We're still very close. Everybody's still living. We're very close. I never married, so I don't have any children, but I have 17 nieces and nephews and 9 great nieces and nephews. And I enjoy coming up to Oregon in the summers. I get to see everybody and see how much they've grown in the year. So that's been a lot of fun.
You also, of course, now live the rest of the year down in, I guess, what's known as the desert southwest in California.
Yes, in Palm Desert.
In Palm Desert. So
right.
Coming up here in the summer, you miss the heat down there at the worst time of the year for heat, and yet you're up here in the nicest time of the year for our weather up in the Pacific Northwest.
Nice. In fact, I'm a little cold when I first come here. Last year, I remember, it was 107 when I left there, and it was 51 when I arrived here, and I immediately caught a horrible cold. But I do enjoy the summers here. They're beautiful. Like today is just a gorgeous 82-degree weather. You know, you can't beat that.
Yeah, it's bright and sunny outside. I really appreciated my drive down here from Olympia this morning. It was a little cloudy up there because there's an offshore wind up there, bringing in a few clouds, but they burn off by mid-morning, and it's gorgeous the rest of the day. And
that's true here as well.
yeah, it's pretty much the same climate. Let's move on a little bit and talk about your education and professional training. I've already mentioned that you studied here at Marylhurst when you were in undergraduate school. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and perhaps about where you went to library school and then eventually law school?
All right. I graduated from St. Mary's Academy. We had moved up from Salem by that time, and so my last 2 years was St. Mary's Academy in Portland. And my father, since there are three of us going to college at the same time, he said, I can help you out with room and board at home if you want to go locally. And we knew Marylhurst. My aunt was a holy name nun, and they're the order that was teaching here. And so it was kind of natural that we came here. I earned a dual major degree in Bachelor of Arts of History and English Lit. And I worked in the language lab. My two sisters worked in the library, go figure. I don't know how that happened that I became the librarian, but I enjoyed the language lab. And my last year I was an RA for the first year students in one of the dorms. But for the most part, we lived at home and commuted. We worked, and I got a scholarship to come here. And we also, by that time, you know, we were working in a cannery rather than picking berries and beans. We were processing them in a cannery, which was quite near our home. And so that paid for our tuition. And then when I went to Catholic University, I earned my master's in library science. And it was some years later, I'm trying to think now, it was a few years later after I had done some work as a librarian that I started law school. And that was at Lewis and Clark, which is also very close to Lake Oswego, where we are. And there I got my JD and going to night school.
Well, it sounds like you were definitely a resident of the state of Oregon, at least up until that point in your life.
I was.
And but somehow along the way, you, shall we say, went off the reservation, so to speak, and ended up in Washington, D.C. And when we were talking in advance with this conversation about, you know, what we might discuss, you mentioned that a nun here at Marylhurst played quite a role in how you decided to go into the library school at Catholic University. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. After I graduated that summer, I was working in the registrar's office here at Marylhurst. And the librarian, Sister Milding, and she said, would you be interested in applying for a federal Title II grant to go to library school at Catholic U? And, you know, I had heard stories from my sisters of how they enjoyed their work in the library, and I thought, well, that would be an interesting career. Probably for me more interesting than teaching at that point. And besides, all the guys were getting the jobs teaching because at that time there was no Title IX, and the men were also asked to coach. So it was natural for them to get the job. So I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. So I applied. It all happened really fast. I mean, that happened earlier in the summer, and in August I was starting library school at Catholic U. It was a wonderful year. For the first time since I was in grade school, I wasn't working to help put myself through school because I had this grant. And so I got to play a little bit, and it was the year of the Martin Luther King riots. that I was back there. So it was definitely different from my Oregon upbringing to be in Washington, D.C. at that time. I enjoyed it very much. I think my favorite class was a class with Dr. Elizabeth Stone, who at that time was going for her PhD in public administration. So she had us doing a lot of her coursework or tangential to her coursework. And my favorite class was, or my favorite area of that class was planning and collection development and kind of the strategic end of the planning. And I always remembered after that class, one of the things that she said, it's always easier to erase from a piece of paper than to knock down walls. And that put me in good stead in my career.
Speaking of your career, before we move on to your specific positions you've held, was there anyone who played a role in perhaps attracting you to law librarianship as opposed to, what I guess could be called regular types of librarianship? You didn't have the law degree yet
No.
at that time, and you went to a school that produced a lot of very fine librarians of all sorts.
And at that time, I'm not sure whether they had a law library program. They do now, but I don't think at that time they did. And when I got out, I actually applied for a job at Willamette University and was in an undergraduate library for 4 years as the first head of circulation there. But I would have to say that it's sort of, my career is sort of like dominoes. I just happen to be at the right place at the right time, and I feel so blessed to have that happen to me. But I can't point to any specific person at the early point of my career, except for a son of my mother's friend who was going to Lewis and Clark Law School and told my mother about this position that was open at Lewis and Clark that I applied for.
So your first job out of library school, you've come back on the reservation, so to speak. You're back out here in Oregon, up in Portland area. Portland, I guess.
Actually, Salem.
Salem is
area.
where the university is. I
Where
stand corrected.
Willamette,
That's right.
Willamette is.
And you're at the General University Library in Willamette. Could you talk a little bit about that position and what you did, and then maybe some of the others you've held later?
I was still at Catholic U when my sister got a job teaching political science at Willamette. And I said, oh, why don't you check in the library and see if there are any positions there? And we could room together someplace in Salem. We had grown up there, so we knew Salem. So she went over to the library and found out that they were creating this new professional position, head of circulation. And so I sent in my application, and I was just about ready to come home. So I came home and immediately went down and interviewed. And I was very blessed again to get that position. The person whose place I took was, of course, a non-professional. She moved to the reserve book room. But she taught me the practicalities of librarianship. And we have been friends since that date. She lives in the area still, and I see her, or she comes down with her husband and visits me in the desert. But that was really a wonderful thing to have somebody that was so generous as she was to, have her place taken, but still teach me.
Basically, was a mentor, I guess.
She
would
was.
be the proper designation
was.
of that relationship.
And then I later hired her when I was at Lewis and Clark to be my circulation person. Because I knew she had done that.
Well, when you were at Lewis and Clark, or Northwestern School of Law of Lewis and Clark, I guess is the correct designation, you were the reference and administration librarian, as I recall.
I was, as I told you, this student there told my mother about the position, and I applied for it. And the librarian director did not have a library degree. He was a tenured professor, Walt Brown, and I think he wanted somebody that had the library knowledge because Lewis and Clark was going for ABA, ALS accreditation at the time. Didn't have really policies and procedures in place. So I was hired, and we quickly hired Penny Hazelton, who was a law student there, to inventory a collection. And then she soon became our serials librarian, or serials person, serials assistant, I guess you would call her at that date. And Lori Flynn was another person that came along later from Willamette. She was working at the law school at Willamette. She came along. We hired her later on. But I think Penny described how we were trying to acquire all these books in a very short time, about 35,000 volumes, in order to meet the criteria of the ABA and ALS. And I feel so sorry for my boss's secretary, because those were the days of carbon paper and correct fluid.
Oh, yes, I remember those too, but not as a secretary. I used them when I had to type papers.
Oh, I know, and yes, I did too. But she would send out all these quote letters to Mr. Hines Sr., Mr. Dennis, and Mr. Rothman. And then we get the quote letters back, and Walt would decide that he would take one of their orders. Well, then a quote later would come in that was cheaper. So we'd have to, I think Penny described how we'd have to box all these books up and send them off. And I thought, oh, my career is shot before I ever get into the business, because we're going to get a horrible reputation with the vendors. But I don't think that happened. But at any rate, one time Mr. Dennis came through, and he was in his 80s, I think, or maybe 90s at that time, and he had just married someone in Las Vegas. And so he was on his honeymoon trip, but he was making a business trip as well. He came through, and because he was hard of hearing, he spoke quite loudly. And he was talking to Walt, and one of the students came up after me and said, "Are we being audited by the IRS?" And I had to laugh because it was so funny. He was, making his point with Walt, and it did sound like it could have been some official. But we had many happy days there, even though we were working so hard. Another thing that we did there, we started planning for a new building while I was there. And Penny was involved in that as well. That, at some point, turned into a faculty administration office and administration building. And so once that was completed, then we had to switch gears and reconfigure the building that we were in. But I got a lot of good experience in that job. My boss was a state senator, so every 6 months he would go off to Salem. I mean, every 2 years, and he would go off to Salem, and for 6 months at a time, I would do his job and my job. And then at one point, the dean told him, you have to give up one of your 3 jobs. And so, being a tenured faculty, he gave up the library job. And at that point, I was the interim director for a year and a half. That was about the time that I was winding down my my night school studies. So I applied for that position, but I think I was viewed at that point more as a student than as an administrator, which I had come on board as. So I was not offered the position. And Penny, by that time, had gone to Maine, and she was working under Don Garbrecht. Don Garbrecht was the consultant to the University of Bridgeport, which was my next posting.
Yes.
And that's how I happened to go far afield again.
Out of the state of
out
Oregon.
Of the state of Oregon.
Way out.
Yeah, that was to Connecticut. And University of Bridgeport had just acquired Wethersfield Law School, which had been a proprietary law school. So they also wanted to go for ABA and ABA accreditation. I don't know if they were going for ALS at the same time. So again, I was building up collections, staff, putting in policies and procedures. But I was the head librarian at that point, which was nice, and could make the decisions. We had 4 inspection teams come.
Wow.
In 4 years. And of course, each one had a different criticism to make and have us correct. The 3rd year they came and they said, well, the building looks too much like 2 bowling alleys put together. It had been an old dorm, a former dorm, and the was an L-shaped. So there were lots of little alcoves, which just students loved because they could hide away in those alcoves. And the collection was, kind of fragmented, but it wasn't bad. At any rate, we were told that we had to plan a new facility or get a new facility. Fortunately, the university gave us the top 2 floors of the university library. So we reconfigured those, did the planning and so forth, and got the 2 top floors. And by the time I left, I had this beautiful corner office that looked out over Long Island Sound.
Oh,
and I could
that
watch
sounds
these
nice.
huge tankers come in. And yes, it was very nice.
How did your colleagues at the university library appreciate you suddenly being neighbors in the same building?
I don't think they thought too much about it because it had been used, I think it had been used by the science department, so they weren't really in it.
Okay.
I think otherwise,
stealing their turf.
no, otherwise I think there would have been some tension there, but no, they were very generous about that, and we got on well together
Well,
as
that
partners.
probably made life
Yeah.
a lot easier for everybody.
It did.
And
very
better.
much so.
Well, the ABA in those days hadn't gotten to the point where they, really fleshed out what it was inspection teams were supposed to be looking for and reporting on. That came more later, but they were still, each team was a little more independent. So when you talk about the concerns that they raised about certain aspects of your building, I think that would be more of that era, just as looking for, I think we were supposed to have 50,000 book volumes on the shelf to be even considered for approval by the American Bar Association in those days. And that was still the way a lot of people foolishly, in my opinion, measured the worth of law libraries.
That's true. I went through many, many inspections and even did some myself. So yes, I think it revolved, and it was easier when I was doing the inspections to have some criteria.
It took a long time to sort of refocus the ABA and others on evaluating libraries on the accessibility that they provided to those who used them, to the materials that they needed, other than pure ownership of a bunch of books, some of which may have been relatively of no value to the users, but they still counted.
I have a funny story to tell about that. I'll try to tell it quickly. One of the quote letters was written by my assistant. And he's actually, if anybody got me into law school, he did, because he had been a Marine chaplain or a military chaplain. And he came back and he started law school. And I was thinking I should know at least as much as the first year students. And he said, Virginia, if you go through the first year, you ought to do the whole thing because the first year is the hardest. So he really talked me into that. But he had more time on his hands than he knew what to do with, because he would write these funny quote letters, or funny letters. And one was a quote letter to, I think it was Rothman. And he was explaining how this red-headed student who worked for us had screwed up. And, well, of course, he was talking about Penny. And we were sending back the Ghana Law Review. And that's why I said some of these were irrelevant, to the collection. I don't even think there was a Ghana Law Review at that time. But anyway, we put this on Penny's desk, and she started reading this, and you could just see the face flame up to match the hair color. And she's ready to stomp into Walt's office, and we said, "Oh, it's just a fake, it's just a fake." But we laughed after that. We laughed so much about that letter because it was so typical, and it could have been one of his letters, that we were sending all this back because we got a cheaper quote. But we had a good time.
Well, it sounds like you were still dealing with the group of original vendors that so many of us were dealing with those years, that were basically supplying the books that we needed to build these law libraries, many of which were being built from scratch.
Right.
Because there were new schools. Fred Dennis, you've mentioned, Bill Hines Sr. Certainly was one of them, Fred Rothman. Phil Cohn at Oceana was usually the fourth one that one hears in that mix.
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned that in one of your jobs, Mr. Dennis had arrived, and he was interrogating, I think that's probably the word I would use for what you described nicely, one of your people, and it sounded like the IRS auditor, a student who was nearby and overheard part of it. Fred had another habit that he used to inflict on my library. We were in the basement in those days of the old law school building at American U, and Fred Dennis would show up about an hour and a half before I'd get there, and he'd proceed to check the shelves and see what, he would then be able to recommend that I really ought to get for the library, or from him. But he'd also then sit down and light up his cigar, and by the time I got there, I think everyone in the place was ready to kill me for having let this man come in and literally smoke the place up.
I don't remember the cigar. He may have done that, but I do remember him checking the shelves before he met with the librarian.
Maybe he had his technique on what would move you to get him out of there as fast as you could, and the cigar smoke worked on me maybe more than it did on others. I don't know.
Right. Well, then that was Bridgeport, and I was doing other things at Bridgeport, which I'll talk about probably later, but or mention later. But after 4 years there, I was ready to come back to the West Coast. I really missed the West Coast. So I came back, and I was paying for a sabbatical myself, let's say. And I took a computer course, and I took an art course, and let's see what else, a French course, and an acting course. I actually took an acting course, and my mother had said to me, "I always wanted to take acting." I said, "Well, take it with me." So she took it with me. She was about in her 70s then. And then I did some interviews. I was coming back from interviewing in Hawaii and a county law library in California, and I just heard about Ann Quigley, who was retiring after 37 and a half years at University of San Francisco. So I thought, well, I'll stop in. I'm right here at the airport. So I stopped in, and I was fortunate to meet the dean and the chair of the search committee and 3 of the staff members. So I think maybe that gave me an edge when they came around to selecting people to interview, because they had over 70 applicants for that position. And again, I guess I was blessed because I ended up there, and I spent 22 years at the University of San Francisco. We didn't have an ABA inspection to get accreditation, but we had several while I was there, of course, because I was there such a long time. We had other issues, though. When I came to interview, they were shelving new books on the floor, and I was sort of appalled, and so I knew what my mission was, to get more space when I first came there. Even though, I was in the day-to-day, I was building up collections and building up staff. Always I was planning in the background, getting more space. The first 2 weeks I made an impression because we took every book off the shelf, got the superseded materials, weeded those out, and then reorganized the collection on the shelves. So that impressed the faculty. After that, I started planning on paper and in my head of where we could go next. And there was a wing that the faculty told me belonged to the library, but there were squatters in it by that time because the library hadn't taken it over. So there were student groups and faculty offices and adjunct faculty. So that was a little, some negotiation there to get that space. Well, I laughingly accused the dean of having a hit person on his development team because we got some money, some beneficiary money, as a result of 2 murders. And one was a judge who had put someone away. The person came out of prison, came to his office. They didn't notify the judge, and he killed him. $50,000 was left to the law school. But in those days, if you didn't spend that money right away, it went into the general fund of the university. Nobody had a plan, but I always had a plan.
Oh, so, I'm not surprised.
So I said to the dean, can we have this $50,000 for a computer center for the students? And he gave it to me. We'd had the dedication, and the widow came, and the partner of this judge came, the law partner. And the law partner said to me he would have been turning over in his grave because he hated computers. And I thought, well, good thing we got it in, And the next time we got $300,000 from a murder on the high seas. And I won't say anything more about that except that it could only happen in San Francisco. And there's a book written about it. It's called Fatal Cruise. And I can't think of the author, but it's a very interesting book. The money was held up in probate because they had to decide where this murder took place. But we finally, one of our attorneys finally said, well, we won't contest the money that was supposed to go to the murderer if we can get the rest out of probate and move forward. So again, we were faced with spending that money right away or having it go to the general fund. So I said, okay, I have a proposal. So I gave it to the dean, and it was to renovate the current library, which we did. And the building was kind of in a seashell shape. And so it was very difficult to get more space, but we closed up the stacks a little bit and were able to get some. And then I started in on the Augean stables in the basement with my staff. It was the place where all the discarded books, all the gifts, all that kind of thing, all the old furniture went. And I was cleaning out one day, and I stumbled on a Maynard Dixon painting. And for those people who don't know, Maynard Dixon was a famous California Western artist. This painting was a beautiful watercolor of a cattle drive out of the Tehachapi Hills. And I took it to the dean and I said, if this belongs to the law school, can we sell it and have the money for the library? And he agreed that we could. So I started checking out the provenance. I went over to the university library and found a book on Maynard Dixon, and this painting was shown in it, and it said, used to belong to so-and-so's collection, whereabouts now unknown. So I felt like I had discovered a Rembrandt. Then I called in Butterfield's auction house, and they came and evaluated it. At that time, that was in the mid-'80s. They said, well, if it was sold here, it'd probably sell for around $30,000. If you took it to the Southwest, it would probably sell for a lot more. It's in pristine condition. Well, it had been hanging in my office and later in the lobby of the library, and when I found out it was valuable, I said, this has to go to the rare book room, and it didn't belong to the law school, unfortunately. It had been loaned to the first dean in that building who wanted something in his office, and the next dean, I guess, didn't want it, and so he put it in the basement. At any rate, it sold a few years ago for close to $1 million. So
would have been a very helpful addition to the book budget, I'm
it
sure.
It would have been nice, and I'm sure the undergraduate librarian got that money for his library. But well, I'm happy
somebody got it.
I'm happy one library got it.
Yeah.
So then I continued building. I continued the planning for the new building because I knew that this new building would have to take place. And I almost lost it where they were going to build a cogen plant on the campus, and they were thinking of this site, and then the neighbors put up a fuss. So I thought, well, the neighbors are going to like a library a lot more than they're going to like a cogen plant. And at that time also, we were looking for a new dean. So I went to Lewis and Clark, and I thought, this former professor at Lewis and Clark that I had was an entrepreneurial type, and his parents live in the Bay Area. So I'm going to contact him and see if he would like to come to USF as dean. So we met, and he applied for the position, and he got it. So that was my first piece of the puzzle to put together. Then we got a new president of the university who was very pro-library. Mm-hmm. In fact, before he was even installed, he came through the law library. He looked at the card catalog and he said, well, you're soon going to be automating that. And I said, well, unfortunately, we've done all the planning with the undergraduate library, but they just told us that there's no money to include us. He said, that's not going to happen. And he went to a meeting of the deans that week, and he told the dean of the library that we were to be included. So I was persona non grata for a little bit with that library dean, but it really benefited both libraries in the end to have that collection expanded, both our collections expanded. So anyway, then that was the second piece, because he was pro-library and he gave the green light for it. He said, the only thing I want to be involved in is the facade. And the dean said, the only thing I want to be involved in is the event space on the top floor that would be used by faculty. So his aesthetic taste and mine were very compatible. So I got to make all the design, my staff and I made all the design choices. And I had a wonderful staff at that. Well, I've always had wonderful staffs. I really have. And I've been blessed in that way too. The third piece of the puzzle in building the law library at USF was Mr. Zeef, who was an alum of the university. And I had heard about him first from the development person who called me, and she said, there's a note in the file that says this person won't give another dime until Father Losciavo is gone. Do you think I ought to contact him? And I said, well, it sounds like he means gone from the face of the earth, but I would give him a call. And it was signed Art Zeef. Well, Art Zeef was irate with the former president of the university because he had shut down the basketball program in the early 80s when there were NCAA violations. But anyway, she contacted him and he gave money that year, and then he continued to give money. So at one point, he read about my dream to build this library that was in one of the alum magazines. And he called up Dean Folberg and he said, I want you to meet me right away. And Dean Folberg said, well, I'm packing to, I'm heading out to the airport. And he said, well, I live by the airport. You can meet me first. So Jay met him, and he gave him a check for $1 million, and he said, there's more to come. I want this to be the signature gift for the new building. I want it named after my wife, who's put up with me for 60 years, but I don't want her to know. Well, that was going to be hard when you're fundraising to keep the signature gift, the donor, a secret. So fortunately, the bank called his house and said, Mrs. Zeef, your husband just wrote a check for $1 million. Was that really him? And the cat was out of the bag. So that worked well. Art Zeef went on to give over $8 million in student scholarships after that. He was always talking when I first met him about dying the next day, but he got so involved with his new building and so involved with the students, we finally bought him a chair so he could sit out and oversee the construction. And he would know all the construction people. He would have lunch with the students. And it really became a wonderful relationship, both for us and Art Zief. And he and his wife have both passed now, but he will always be a big memory, especially since her name is on the library. It's the Doreen Zief Law Library.
I noticed that in looking at the website.
Yes.
Now we know where the name came from.
Yeah.
How he was going to keep it from her,
I have no idea, and we were sweating bullets because
well,
we
the
had...
bank saved all of that problem.
They surely did.
But somehow I would suspect when she looked at the front door of the library and discovered her name on it, the cat would be out of the bag pretty fast.
The cat would be out of the bag. And then another key person was an alum who actually owned a lot of television stations. And he was asked, you know, do you think we need a library? He said, I remember working in the library under Ann Quigley. And he said, I could put a lot of law courses on my television. But he said, what I remember from the library, it was a place of community. And he said, I think USF needs a place of community, and that place is the library. And it has turned out to be that way. The year that we opened, we had 1,000% increase in the use of the library. And that's documented. And so
that's helpful, because often the faculty don't use it, so they look around and see that they could use a little more space for offices or something, and they forget that the students have to be someplace, and the library becomes their home.
Right. Well, I had even in the plans had space for visitors, adjuncts, and retiring faculty, because I thought that was important. But before we even moved in, those were gone for legal research and writing instructors.
Yeah.
So that happens, but you know.
Probably essentially a better use, at least in the eyes of the dean and administration.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's
Still, it would be nice to have all those things. Have your colleagues who are retired or semi-retired from the faculty there.
And they do come back times. I know Tom McCarthy, who has done a lot in the intellectual property area, still writes, and does Bill Bassett. So they're still publishing and still have a connection.
Good. Well, that's probably true at most schools, where people tend to stay around when they retire, unlike you, who moved to Palm Desert, and unlike me, who moved across the country to Olympia from Washington, D.C. Most of our colleagues who retire do still come around the law school.
Well, I think sometimes it's important to not be around so much, so the new librarian can bond with the staff and bring in their own staff, and I think that's important too. So that's one of the reasons I see them, but I'm not intrusive in it, you know.
I agreed with the same way. I mean, I had the library for 30 years under my directorship, and Billy Joe Kaufman came in to replace me, and it was correct that it become her library. She's been there 10 years now, so you know it certainly has by now.
And that's one thing I learned about doing inspections and going other places, that you really learn a lot from being in another institution, and those people can bring a lot to you when they come to your institution that you haven't thought about. So, you know,
I always used to describe it as stealing all the good ideas I discovered while I was doing inspections and visits.
Well, I think mine was always don't reinvent the wheel, and that's why I like to present. And
that's probably a more desirable way of phrasing it.
And I think that's why that's what I would tell new law librarians, to get out there and speak and present if you've got good ideas, because we're so busy, we don't need to reinvent the wheel at each institution, and it helps to have somebody do that for you. I knew moving into a bigger facility, we were going into a 65,000 square foot building when this new building took shape, that we'd have to work differently. So we went through reorganization with formal reorganization studies. And that paid off because in 2001, the library staff won the Team Award, University of San Francisco's Team Spirit Award, which was really nice that they acknowledged that. So I have to say that in that position, I got to do so many things because I was on university committees. I was on the search committee for the vice president provost, for the public safety director. I was on committees that when we had to downsize staff all over campus. And I was on several faculty committees at that time too. At Bridgeport, I was an assistant professor, and then while I was at USF, I was associate. I came in as associate and got full professorship. But my contract specifically said I wasn't to teach at USF, which was okay. I had so much other stuff to do. But at one point then, J Folberg, who was this entrepreneurial person that I encouraged to apply for dean, came on board. And he said, I really think you ought to teach. So and I started doing that.
One of the areas that we talked about before we started this conversation was a little bit about your teaching. And now that you've sort of introduced it so nicely, why don't we talk about that? Earlier you mentioned that you'd taken courses in art and so on, and perhaps that's in preparation the art law and protection of cultural heritage that you taught in some of your law teaching.
Well,
you want to talk a little bit about that and your other teaching?
I'll back up to Bridgeport because when I went to Bridgeport, even though I had a very challenging library job, they also asked me to be the administrator of the first year legal research and writing program, and also the first year trial advocacy programs. So we hired recent grads, and I supervised them and also taught in the program. That's why I took a paid sabbatical. I was kind of burnt out after the 4 years at Bridgeport. But at any rate, when I came on board at USF, I was sort of glad that I didn't have to teach because I knew there was a lot to do. And their staff was very small at the time. I knew I had to build up the staff as well. So at one point, though, this was later in my career, probably in the 90s, J Folberg, who was dean at that time, said, Virginia, I think you ought to start teaching. And he didn't say, you have to teach here or there. So I thought, well, I'm going to teach what I want to teach. And I loved international law, and I loved art law. I took art law from Leonard Duboff, who had studied under John Merriman, who was very well known as an art law professor, probably one of the best known art law professors at Stanford. And I had done the desk book, the index for his desk book to art law, Leonard Duboff's desk book to art law. So I thought, I'm going to do art law and international law and combine the two. And at that time, the walls were just breaking down in Eastern Europe, and they were discovering that Russia had a lot of the gold treasures from Berlin that they had thought were lost during the war, so it was kind of an interesting time to teach it. So I put together a course that was international art law and the protection of cultural heritage. I also put on a visual arts and the law conference for NoCal around the same time. And I was teaching the copyright aspects and the stolen art aspects of that course. I also, with one of my professor colleagues, taught the first ADR course at USF. And I taught the negotiation component, and I was trying to think what component he taught, and it wasn't negotiation, but I can't recall what it was. But we did that for 1 year. And then, because J Folberg was an ADR person, he really encouraged it once he came on as dean, and so there are myriad of courses taught now in ADR. I also always wanted to get into teaching about the European Union, which I guess now, but that was back in the 80s when I was sort of shocked when I was dating a Scotsman and he'd start talking about what the European Union would do if they all got together and on the same footing. And I thought, wow, they could really compete with the United States if that happened. So I always wanted to teach that, but that never happened. But other people are doing it now, so I'm glad.
Well, maybe a few moments ago you mentioned that you actually put a presentation together for the Northern California Association of Law Libraries. That might be a nice sort of introduction to the things that you did for our profession, but outside of your university setting.
Okay.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I was an officer. I think I was secretary-treasurer when I was back in Connecticut for the the New England Law Library Association.
That's right. I noticed that in the background information I found in preparing for today's chat.
And I was a member of WestPAC when I was at Lewis and Clark. And then I went through all the offices for NoCal. So in addition to the visual arts one, I put on, before we had microcomputers in the library, I put on a microcomputer institute. And I also wrote an article about microcomputers in the law library policies and procedures. And that was in the early to mid 80s, I think. So that was pretty early on.
Why don't we talk about a venture you and I both shared along with some others, and that was the year 1992 when the ALL annual meeting was in San Francisco. You and our colleague Joan Holland were in charge of local arrangements, and I was the program chair.
That's right.
And we had some interesting times. Do you
I
want?
think Carolyn Ahern was the president.
She was
that
the
year.
president. Yes.
That was a really fond memory that I have working with Joan Holland. She was super to work with. We had 22 committees. That's when you did everything. You know, the head office didn't do much except come out and do site visits, and then you had committees that put all the local arrangements together. And so I remember we had 22 committees, and they were fabulous people in San Francisco that did that, I worked with. And I think everybody enjoyed it. I still remember with Joan standing at the check-in counter of the Hilton Hotel. We were handing out Ghirardelli chocolates to everybody, and that was a big hit. But you probably have other memories of that.
Actually, I had some pretty good ones too.
Yeah.
We were a good team. I remember all of us, and I can still remember the organizational meeting when we all came out early, some weeks before the actual meeting, and sat down and figured out what we were going to do and how we were going to pay for it. That was important, and that's when I got my marching orders in terms of how much money I had as program chair to use to put on the program.
Right, we all had budgets we had to work with.
Yeah,
that's right.
But it was a good city.
It
It's
was
always a good city in which for the group to meet. There was a lot to do both in the meeting and outside.
And it was close to 5,000 people that came to that meeting.
It was one of the, it was sort of the beginning of the peak in terms of size for a few years now. In more recent years, I guess with budget cuts and other things, the number, the going to annual meetings has dropped a bit. Not tremendously, but that was more of the period when it was a peak period.
Right.
And of course, a city like San Francisco, among a few others, were very attractive.
It was very attractive.
Yeah, people wanted to come. Well, I think we've sort of covered the waterfront. Earlier you mentioned something more you wanted to say about your experience at the University of Bridgeport, and I thought before we begin to wrap this up, I'd give you an opportunity if you could.
Oh, I think that was teaching, that I was not just the librarian, but I was administering these programs.
That's right. You've now sort of covered that.
Yeah. But in regards to the work for the organizations, I also did a lot of speaking, presenting. The highlights there, I would say, probably the Duke Building Conference, and I did bricks, bites, and continuous renovation up at University of Washington. I think also for the AALL meeting, and so I did a lot of speaking on collection development, strategic planning for building up your collection or your staff, that kind of thing. So.
Well, you had a pretty extensive experience doing that, some from scratch, some like the University of San Francisco, more from a mature to a more mature level.
It was really transformational at USF. The faculty kept, I would hear them in faculty meetings says, oh, if we only had more space, we could get more faculty and we could teach more courses. And I knew it was that if we got this building, it would be transformational, and it has been. It's they were able to take over the building that we vacated and did that. And my staff and I also got the law school up and running on technology as well as the library, because they weren't really into it, and I was the first director of the technology program, and then I was on technology advisory committees and other committees for the law school that were administrative.
Well, I've enjoyed chatting with you this afternoon, but before we sort of wrap things up, I want to give you the opportunity that is customary, and that is there anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to mention at this point?
I think I've probably said enough, but I do want to thank all of the staffs that I've had over the years. I mean, my life would have been a lot harder if I hadn't had cooperative staffs that worked so hard. And I thank the deans that I had that gave me free rein to do things. I mean, there are a lot of deans that wouldn't give you free rein to make all the decisions. I was able to get my staff together. We did the programming. The architect said it was the best library program they had ever seen. I didn't give them a whole lot of room to build monuments to themselves, but it really functions well. And for those things, I'm really grateful. I just feel I've had a very blessed career. And I'm sort of like Leah Chain, I think, said, I don't miss the work, but I miss the people. And so on my way down to the desert or coming up, I try to typically stop and see people in San Francisco. Stop in the library, check it out. It looks
wonderful
pretty good.
Colleagues of ours.
Wonderful colleagues,
along the way.
And one group I forgot to mention was the Jesuit group that used to meet at all the ALL meetings.
I remember. I was never a member, but I heard that you all got together.
You worked at the wrong school. Bob Oakley was in there, though, from
I was working officially for the Methodists, although American U is pretty secular.
Yeah.
But,
I have a funny story about the Methodists. My first institution was Methodist, and the president, he could never say this now, but he looked at my resume and he said, well, I see you've gone all through Catholic schools. Do you think you could work in a Methodist institution? I said, oh, yes, I can work here.
Time to be ecumenical.
That's true. That's true.
Well, I want to thank you, Virginia Kelch, not just on my behalf, but also on behalf of our colleagues Frank Hodek and Michelle Wu, with whom I'm working on these oral histories. And I want to thank you for meeting with us, with me this afternoon, and chatting a little bit about all the various memories you have of a long and very distinguished career in the law library profession.
Well, it was really a fun career, and thank you for doing the oral histories to capture some of this before it's all gone.
Thank you.